In August, the Financial Times reported that the Chancellor was considering funding the £9 billion Thames crossing using a private finance initiative-style funding arrangement. NHS England Chief Executive Amanda Pritchard has made similar suggestions for the NHS. This should send a shiver down the spine of everyone who recalls the New Labour years. PFI was derided for waste, poor value for money and flexibility, particularly in reference to highly complex contract termination procedures and the huge profits generated. However, there is no zealot like a convert. Having railed against PFI in opposition, Labour in office opened the floodgates with an evangelical enthusiasm few could have foreseen. When New Labour proposed changes to reinvigorate PFI, the unconcealed glee of financiers should have been an early warning sign. Under the new regime, the private sector would be allowed to earn profits without bearing any risks. The new PFI contracts, renamed public-private partnerships, lack clauses allowing the government to recoup windfall profits. Under these lucrative terms, the private sector gorged itself on PPP deals, while Labour boasted that projects worth £14 billion would be agreed by the end of 1999. All while local authority capital budgets were cut and Chancellor Gordon Brown stuck to Tory spending rules. PPP fervour trickled down the Labour Party as parliamentarians too amazed by the level of investment. In this Parliament's first ever SNP-led opposition debate on 24 June 1999, Labour, Tory and Lib Dem MSPs came out to bat for PPP. Protests about its obvious flaws were dismissed with claims that if someone was against PPP, they must also be opposed to the new school or hospital in their area. Thus, Labour blithely condemned Scottish public services to unprecedented debt levels for decades. Even now, nearly 18 years after Labour left office at Holyrood, the extent of their PPP profligacy is staggering. Labour built a debt mountain so high we have yet to reach the top, but we will soon. Annual payments are still rising and will peak at an eye-watering £1,250 million this coming financial year. Total remaining PPP debt in Scotland is projected at £12,483 million from 25-26. North Ayrshire Council will have to pay over £16 million next year for full... North Ayrshire Council will have to pay over £16 million next year for 4 secondary schools built nearly 2 decades ago. Schools that still had snagging problems 2 years after completion. That sum limits the Council's ability to invest in jobs and services, and by the time the contract ends in 2038, it will have cost £443.4 million for schools worth £83 million. Now, Kilmarnock Prison was built for £32 million when it went into operation in 1999. By the time the contract ended last year, taxpayers had shelled out £367.64 million. The contract for a £45.5 million wastewater project in Leavenmouth required an astonishing £721.2 million in repayments, a shocking 16 times the original cost. PPP remains a millstone around the neck of Scotland's public services. To put its impact on local authority finances into perspective, 31 pence in every pound of council tax raised in North Ayrshire goes towards the council's PPP obligations. And in Inverclyde, Stuart McMillan will be interested to know that it's 45 pence, and in Clackmannanshire, 52 pence in the pound. And as Michael Mara is the only Labour member present in the chamber just now, I will advise that Dundee City, it's 32.4% of all council tax raised will actually go in PPP payments this current year. In many cases, the public won't even own the buildings by the time the contracts end. Research by BBC Scotland revealed there are 11 PPP contracts expiring where the public sector will have to shell out tens of millions to actually own the buildings it spent years paying through the nose for. Thankfully, once the Government and the SNP took swift action to abolish PPP, through the non-profit distribution model, schools and hospital construction projects were financed through conventional means or via the Scottish Futures Trust, with private profits capped at 5% and surpluses directed to the public sector. NPD projects averaged 58% of the repayment costs of a PPP project, most of the costs going on interest payments. Had the projects funded through NPD been carried out under PPP, the Scottish taxpayer would have been on the hook for an additional £7,735 million over the life of these contracts. Today's debate is not just a history lesson or a trip down memory lane, it's a warning. While our current Chancellor's CV may not be as impressive as Gordon Brown's, the situation she finds herself in has parallels. A Labour Party which came to power by tacking to the centre and beyond, unsure of what it believes in, promising investment to repair Britain's crumbling infrastructure, balanced against self-imposed fiscal rules aimed at wooing the city. And a large enough parliamentary majority to override scrutiny or backbench rebellions, albeit that 19 newly elected Labour MPs have already been expelled, suspended or resigned. The attractiveness of PFI or PPP to governments looking to keep debt off book diminished as Eurostat rules on accounting for EU member states led to the majority of such projects being classed as public debt. However, post-Brexit, there is nothing to stop the UK deviating from this. We must never return to the tens of billions of pounds wasted on PFI and PPP deals in Scotland, ensuring that future generations are not burdened with the same mistakes. That Labour would even consider the return of PFI shows they cannot be trusted with Scotland's finances. The UK Government should rule out any return to PFI, and Labour in Scotland make their own opposition crystal clear. Thank you.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And I thank Kenneth Gibson for bringing forward his motion in order that we could have this important debate on the ongoing cost to the public sector of private finance initiatives, or PFI. First used in 1993 by the Tory Chancellor Kenneth Clarke and in 1997 adopted by Tony Blair's Labour government. Remember, Labour's reasons for adopting PFI was, as stated by the then Chancellor of the Exchequer, Gordon Brown, who struggled to provide a rationale for PFI other than, and I quote, "The public sector is bad at management and that only the private sector is efficient and can manage services well." Well, what's the reality of PFI construction projects here in Edinburgh and for my constituents of Edinburgh Pentlands? The Edinburgh Royal Infirmary was completed in 2003 and was one of the most prominent PFI projects in Scotland. Built at a cost of £184 million, the total cost to taxpayers over the contract's lifespan is significantly higher, with estimates suggesting payments could exceed £1.1 billion by the contract conclusion in 2027. So how's that contract performed? Well, in 2022, NHS Lothian said it was in dispute over the nature and delivery of the maintenance and upgrades required for the hospital. The issues placed on NHS Lothian's risk register warned that there is, and I quote, risk that facilities in the Royal Infirmary are not fit for purpose because of a failure to carry out required life cycle works and maintenance of the estate. The risk register lists heating, ventilation, water, window maintenance as some of the life cycle works that could present a problem. The Health Board at the time warned it could, if necessary, retain some of the PFI payments to Consort Healthcare if the issues are not satisfactorily resolved. However, the complicated deal for the hospital means that NHS Lothian will in 2027 enter a secondary contract period potentially lasting until 2053, where it will still pay a management charge to Consort Healthcare. Presiding Officer, then there is the Edinburgh Schools debacle. In the late 1990s, Labour-run Edinburgh City Council embarked on a massive school rebuilding and refurbishment programme under PFI. The total capital cost for the project was around £140 million. The PFI deal was structured over a 30-year period, with the total cost over the life of the contract projected to be much higher, with estimates at well over £500 million when factoring in maintenance, operation and finance charges. In January 2016, during a storm, 9 tonnes of masonry fell as a gable end collapsed at Oxgangs Primary School in my constituency. Fortunately, no pupils or teachers were injured. This resulted in 10 primaries, 5 secondaries and 2 additional support needs schools being closed, impacting the education of around 7,600 pupils because of concerns over the standard of construction across the city. The impact of these PFI projects in Edinburgh have been criticised for their inflated costs to the public sector, often much higher than if the project had been constructed using public borrowing and public procuring. It's reported that Rachel Reeves may again be considering PFI. She should consider the words of a former chairman of RBS, Sir Howard Davis, who in 2018 made an admission on BBC One's Question Time when he stated that PFI had been, and I quote, a fraud on the people.
Thank you, Mr MacDonald. And like me, Mr Gibson has concerns about the negative impact that PPP and PFI burden has inflicted on the public sector. It's yet another real example of Labour's desire to replicate Tory party policy. Presiding Officer, this debate today serves as a stark reminder of why the Labour Party cannot be trusted to manage Scotland's finances. PFIs and PPP have left a harmful and lasting legacy in Scotland, first introduced under the Tory Westminster government in 1990 and fully embraced by the successive Labour governments in Westminster and Holyrood. These were posed as effective solutions, but have instead burdened Scotland's public services and taxpayers. According to Professor Kieran Conley, they have produced projects with assets worth 60 billion, which are costing the taxpayer 170 billion. That's a gap of 110 billion between the assets are worth and what the taxpayer is paying for them. Costs obviously end up getting passed on to the taxpayer, which, according to Professor Conley, can constrain what authorities such as the NHS can spend on essential services, forcing them to reduce budgets accordingly. And this also impacts on local council budgets. In my own area of Clydebank and Mulgai constituency, 37.9% of all council tax in East Dunbartonshire and 41.2% of council tax in West Dunbartonshire goes to PPP payments. Labour's financial mismanagement has led to severe consequences, and their wasteful PFI deals have footed a £30 billion repayments bill on Scottish taxpayers, forcing us all to pay many times more than the original cost of the projects. The funds used to pay for these agreements would have been much better spent on our public services to support education or to tackle child poverty. Instead, it was left to the SNP to fix Labour's mess, and under the SNP Scottish Government, we moved away from this model to a model which, importantly, does not see the surpluses going into the pockets of big investors, as Labour allowed. One perfect example is the hospital car parking charges, a terrible legacy of PFI, and under the Scottish Government we scrapped the hospital car parking charges which were in place because of Labour PFI deals. Scotland continues to pay extortionate amounts for Labour's incompetence, with the figures in 2023 shows that the amount still owed under PPP for hospitals and schools is still £15.4 billion, not even half of Labour's eye-watering total PPP bill. Presiding Officer, these contracts are not just an enormously expensive way to borrow, but they're often inflexible. A 2019 report by JPI Media Investigations found that schools, hospitals and police forces have been locked in the iron grip of contractors, paying extortionate extra charges. Examples within this report found the school being charged £25,000 for 3 parasols and the hospital trust paying £5,500 for a new sink. These contracts are extremely profitable to the private sector, but not for the taxpayer. So nearly 18 years after Labour were kicked out of office in Scotland, we are still paying that heavy price for the disastrous PPP contracts. The Scottish taxpayers have had to shell out enormous sums of money above the actual cost of projects, all while PPP contractors hoard huge profits. In conclusion, Presiding Officer, it's quite clear PPP contracts have been disastrous for Scotland's public finances. So it is welcome that the Scottish Government recognise these options for what they are, extremely poor value for money, and something that is certainly not in the best interest of the Scottish people. Thank you.
PPP and PFI are long-term contracts where public sector organisations pay annual charges to private companies for capital projects like schools and hospitals. These schemes were introduced by the Conservatives but enthusiastically rolled out by previous Labour governments. And with the Scottish Government continuing to face the most challenging financial situation since devolution, it is right that we look at the drain of the repaying dodgy PFI deals. Labour have not been in government in Scotland for 18 years, yet Scotland's public services have been saddled with well over £14 billion in repayment charges since Labour left office. Indeed, as Mr Gibson pointed out, a shocking £1.25 billion will be repaid in PFI and PPP charges by Scotland's public services in 2025-26. Over the years, private companies benefiting from these deals have distributed hundreds of millions of pounds in dividends to investors from their huge profits, diverting cash from frontline health, education, transport and justice services into the pockets of investors. So focusing on East Kilbride, Hairmyres Hospital was rebuilt over 20 years ago with a capital value of £68 million. Yet this year alone, NHS Lanarkshire will pay around £27 million in PFI charges for Hairmyres. That is enough money to pay the salaries of around 850 new nurses. Shockingly, this deal is a 31-year contract, and overall it is estimated that repayments will total around £700 million for Hairmyres, over 10 times the original capital cost, and an absolute disgrace. And it is not just the NHS that is saddled with large payments. South Lanarkshire Council is paying around £43 million this year. Yeah, happy to take it in.
Can I thank Colette Stevenson for taking the intervention? Does she agree with me that we need much greater clarity on what is going to happen when these deals expire, including for the large number of health service facilities?
And yeah, indeed, I wholeheartedly agree that we do need more information in relation to when the contracts, particularly given the scale of the money that we're talking about here as well. So thank you for that. So again, in this year in charges for some schools, with almost 32.7% council tax receipts going towards as well PPP. And, but over the 30-year contract as well, the council will pay back an estimated £1.25 billion. And it's on its website, the Labour-run council boasts that it is among the biggest UK-wide education public-private partnerships. But perhaps it should be straight with the public when talking about local government financing. Dodgy Labour decisions of the past are an ongoing drain on public finances, and it gets worse. Despite warnings at the time that capacity would be an issue, the decision to merge 6 of East Kilbride's high schools into 3 super schools as part of this costly initiative is now having to be rectified, with more money to be spent expanding St Andrews and St Bride's High School. To conclude, Presiding Officer, Labour's obsession with PPP and PFI is reckless. Despite not being in government in Scotland for 18 years, these deals have had and will continue to have a huge impact on public services. Councils, health boards and other public bodies are on average paying back more than 3 times the original capital cost to private companies on long-term deals. But in East Kilbride, the Hairmyres Hospital deal offers a 10-fold return to investors. This is a shameful legacy of the last Labour Scottish Government, rightly kicked out of the office 18 years ago.
PFI, if you mention this to the public, will not mean much, but it matters. The acronym stands for Private Finance Initiative, meaning in practice, private companies build the likes of schools for local authorities, which entered into a contract to pay for the building over a period, often for decades. And this is the key, ownership only passing, generally speaking, contracts do vary, to the council at the end of the contract. This seemed to Labour at the UK level a whiz of an idea, and was eagerly adopted by Labour when they were in power here. Shiny new schools, what's not to like? When the SNP came into government, it was ditched, and for good reason. PFI, build now, pay as you go, is actually meant, for example, that 3 schools in the borders, Eyemouth, Duns and Elston, at a build cost of £72.5 million, will actually cost the council, with annual payment obligations, £350 million by 2037, by which time the schools will be pretty old. It's rather like buying a car on HP. Always read the figures at the bottom of the contract. They can be eye-watering, and by the time you own the car, it's towards the end of its journey. It's the same for schools under PFI. In comparison, the new Gala Academy in Peebles High will not be built in this expensive manner. In Midlothian, I understand that PFI contracts for 5 schools are costing the council around £1 million per month. I'll repeat that, £1 million a month. So we must never forget the ongoing damaging costs of these contracts, reducing by millions the funding Borders and Midlothian councils could use elsewhere and put to better use. Finally, these contracts often come with other tough provisions, such as paying for private maintenance. And now we see in England private companies shirking their contractual obligations for repair and maintain, particularly as these contracts come to an end. These financial burdens, bequeathed by Labour, remind us that not only are they making an economic mess now, they made it before. And Borders and Midlothian will for decades to continue to pay through the nose for that PFI mess. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Graham. We call on the Minister, Ivan McKee, to respond to the debate. Up to 7 minutes. 7 minutes, please, Minister.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and thank you to Kenny Gibson for bringing this important debate this afternoon, and to all members for their participation. The Scottish Government has always recognised that public-private partnerships are more expensive in cash terms than capital grant funding any particular project. In 2007, the new Scottish Government administration made clear that the PFI approach used in the past had not delivered best value for the taxpayer in Scotland. It was made clear that PFI was an expensive mistake and no longer a feasible option. The Scottish Government moved away from using PFI for any new projects from May 2007 and announced the non-profit distribution programme in November 2010. Prior to the NPD programme, the NPD model had been developed as an alternative to PFI in Scotland, and 5 earlier NPD-type contracts were signed between 2005 and 2010. The NPD model was further developed by the Scottish Futures Trust, who also managed the NPD programme, and it's delivered through 2 channels, NPD itself and the Hub, between 2010 to 2021, when the last project became operational. In 2019, however, the Scottish Government signalled a new approach to revenue financing due to the implications of classification changes affecting the NPD programme. The classification changes meant that the revenue-funded NPD and hub models were to be classified to the public sector and subsequently no longer provided additionality. Revenue-funded NPD and hub models have not been used for any new project since. The only private finance approach currently available is the mutual investment model, which will be considered alongside a range of other financing approaches. We've always been clear about our concerns about the flexibility and value for money offered by historic PFI contracts. That's why we brought them to an end. The PFI contracts that remain operational are often complex and need active management, which this Government remains committed to doing. The termination of any PFI contract, I'll just come on to this point, the termination of any PFI contract, however, is a matter for the public sector body that awarded it. PFIs are long-term contracts where risk and reward are set at the outset. Early termination can be a complex and expensive process, and the costs of breaking long-term contracts are substantial, and each authority would require to consider